Hello, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. I hope everybody can see me. And most importantly, I hope everybody's having an incredibly chill day. Hey. So today we're going to be talking to Bruce Lawson. I like to consider him a close personal friend of mine. And you know what? He permits me to, which is delightful. And we're going to be talking with him today about HTML, or how Timbo made Loveliness. Bruce just has the most exciting background. He's done so much, it's terrifying. But we're going to go ahead and let Bruce introduce himself. Yeah? Everybody yell friendly, encouraging things because I've been telling him so much about how lovely my students are. Let's welcome him to the stage.
Hi,
Bruce.
everybody. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for the charming intro, Jess.
I'll let you go.
Thank you for the charming intro, Jess. I will let you be my friend on Friday night when you buy me a beer. Hi, everybody. I'm Bruce, and this talk is about how Timbo, or Sir Tim Berners-Lee, as you call him, made Loveliness, because that's what HTML stands for. I'm allowed to call him Timbo because both of his parents were born in Birmingham, which is where I live. So we're kind of practically relatives. A little bit about me. This isn't to show off. I have variously been tech lead for a large legal organization in the UK, an actor, a musician, a kindergarten teacher. I was English tutor to a princess in Thailand, a volunteer pharmacist in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is now, a tarot card reader in Istanbul for 2 years, a movie extra in Mumbai. I was in a straight to VHS film called The Maharaja Ranjit Singh, a Fortran programmer in the late 80s. Right now, I'm a consultant. So I work with companies from Israel, UK, US, Europe, and I'm also an accessibility bore at Babylon Health. But this talk is me. It's not my employer or my clients. It's just me. So don't blame anybody else. If, however, you feel like you would be interested in testing web accessibility on iOS and Android devices, I'm looking to hire somebody, so hit me up on the Twitter. Why do I tell you that? I tell you that because Jess has told me a lot about you as a group, and I want to assure you that not having a traditional computer science university background is no barrier to getting a job that is fun, takes you around the world if you want to, and working in tech. This is my background, nothing traditional in it. And in fact, my degree is English literature and drama. I've got no background in computers at all. And there's me weeping at the transient beauty of the world as I read some poetry next to some flowers, just so you can see I'm not a traditional computer engineer. I'm here because I was one of the editors of the HTML 5.3 specification with the W3C. and Jess has told me that quite a few of you have questions, you are frustrated, or you're just plain angry and mad at what a mess HTML is. So I'm going to show you why it's that mess and why it's a good mess. I was one of the people who worked to write the British standard for commissioning accessible websites, BS 8878, which has now become the ISO, the international standard. And I've co-written these 2 books, Introducing HTML5 and Web Accessibility. Don't bother buying them. They're out of date, and you can find a free PDF on the web if you want to. But actually, this is not the reason that I'm here. This is the reason that I'm here. In 1996, I went to live in Bangkok in Thailand, where I helped set up a kindergarten and a primary school. There's me. Yes, it is me, even though I've a lot less kilos in those days. There's me and some of my students on sports day. And around 1999, I got a bit sick, and my eye hurt, my left eye, and then my left leg and left arm started being weird, and then they kind of just sort of stopped working. And I went to a hospital in Bangkok, and they did lots of tests, which weren't much fun. And they took this rather lovely photograph of my gorgeous brain. Yes, I know I do have a brain. That's it. And the thing in the red circle isn't in my brain, by the way. But the thing inside the red circle is what is called a sclerosis. And they diagnosed me with multiple sclerosis, which it's a treatable but an incurable disease of the spine that can it affects my motor control, so I can't necessarily use a mouse with great accuracy. It can make me tired, it can make me have tremors, and it can affect my eyesight. But in Southeast Asia, multiple sclerosis is not very common, and in the 90s they didn't have access to much English language information about it. They were very kind in the hospital. They Xeroxed some medical textbooks, but those were full of pictures of dead people's brains sliced up like this. They didn't actually slice my brain, by the way. This is an MRI scan. And I didn't find that very encouraging. So when I taught myself to walk and got out of hospital, near my apartment on the Petchaburi Road in Bangkok was something called an internet cafe. So I went in and I went up to this huge, great big, bulky, beige box, and I typed in multiple sclerosis into Alta Vista, which was like Google search, but in black and white and powered by Steam. And I typed in multiple sclerosis, and I found this. And it's a website made by a woman in London called Julie, and it's a global support network for people who live with multiple sclerosis. Julie was 25 when she founded it, 4 years before I got diagnosed. And what it was people all around the world, from New Zealand, Canada, Norway, the States, some people in Asia who'd got really unlucky. And the thing we had in common was we all had MS and we supported each other. And that blew my mind, because being an English literature and drama graduate, my interest is communication. And suddenly here's a mechanism, a medium by which anybody across the world can communicate with each other. Doesn't matter whether you've got a slow computer or a fast computer, an old Nokia feature phone or the highest end MacBook Pro, you can use the web and communicate. And this blew my mind. So when I came back to the UK in the year 2000, I decided I was going to work on the web. And my interest in the web is communication. I'm going to be talking about HTML, and I'm going to be talking about some code stuff. Don't worry if you don't understand every nuance of it. That's not what I'm here for. But every time I talk about this code stuff, I don't care about it. I care about what it can do. And what it can do is allow people to talk to other people. Yes, I've learned some geeky stuff on the way, but it's a means to an end for me. But you could say that I am an HTML-aholic. HTML is the foundational language upon which all websites are made. Yes, we can use CSS for making them look pretty. And if you don't know what CSS is, don't worry, it doesn't matter. Yes, we can use JavaScript for adding extra bells and whistles. And if you don't know what JavaScript is, don't worry, doesn't matter now. And we can use all kind of fancy technologies like React and Angular to help construct our websites. And if you don't know what they are, Don't worry, doesn't matter. My point is, whatever else you do in your career, and you'll probably jump from different tech stacks to different tech stacks, all of them will be making HTML for you. And the fact that you have a machine to make the HTML doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be great HTML. In the same way, if you're a terrible cook, but you have a very expensive food processor, it's not going to make your food better. It's just going to save you some time, but the end result will be terrible. So we're going to go on an HTML treasure hunt and look at the great things that are in HTML. Sometimes it can be hard to find them, particularly if you've come from a different, more traditional programming language, one that was invented by a company like Swift or Java. Sometimes it can be difficult to see that there's treasure in HTML, so we have to dig. But I'm going to show you that if you use HTML properly, like Sir Uncle Timbo wanted, your websites will be more performant. That is, they will be faster. And lots of statistics show that the longer people have to wait for a website to render on the screen, the more likely they are is to leave and go to a different website, a competitor website. If you use HTML properly, your websites will be more accessible. And by that, I mean something very specific. It'll be more able to be used by people with disabilities, not just blind people. Those are the ones everybody talks about, but people like me who from time to time, if I'm tired or stressed, I can't use the mouse terribly well. People who are deaf, people who maybe are paralyzed and use just a finger to control a stick. Somebody who's quadriplegic who sips and blows through a straw. If you use HTML properly, your websites will be accessible to everybody. Yes, in many countries like the UK, like the US, like Japan, Korea, Israel, this is a legal requirement, but I would argue that it's a moral requirement. And I'd also argue that it's a business requirement, because the World Health Organization says that across the world, 10% of people have some disability. And correct me if I'm wrong, but nobody ever got rich by turning away customers. Excuse me. If you use HTML properly, your websites will be more robust. That is, they are more resistant to failure. We all have experience wherever you are in the world. If I go into an underground station in London, sometimes the network just stops. If you are in rush hour traffic in Mumbai or Jakarta, the network might conk out. If all of your website is made with good HTML, it probably will continue to work. It might not look the same, it might not behave the same, but it will work. You'll have less code to write, and the good thing about having less code to write, there's two things. Nobody pays you per line. In fact, the best coders know how to write less. Generally, less is more. But if you have less code to write, you have less code to test. And less code to test is an important thing because it gives you more time in the pub. And I'm aware that we're a disparate group of people, so many of you may not go to the pub, but it still means more time with your family, more time with your friends, more time doing what you like doing, which probably isn't testing code. So let's look more at the treasure map. Use HTML properly. Write more HTML. Now, I said less is more. What I mean is write more HTML and less other stuff. Use CSS properly. And the thing I want you to take home is built-in beats bolt-on bigly. Maybe get a tattoo of it on your upper forearm. Built-in beats bolt-on bigly. What I mean by this is if HTML has something built into it that the browser just gives you because you're using the correct HTML tag, it's silly to use a different wrong tag and then have to write lots of JavaScript to bolt on the functionality that you would have got for free if you'd used the right tag. It's always better to use something built in than to add it on afterwards. So I'm aware that many of you are just beginning your career in coding, so I don't want to go too much into code and lose you. But let's talk about furniture, because we all have some and we all use it. There is this book by Mr. Alan Peters, The Technique of Furniture Making. It came out 40 years ago, and since it's 50 years ago, since its first publication in 1970, the technique of furniture making has established itself as the Bible for all woodworkers. And in the introduction, it says, any textbook concerned with the techniques of furniture making must deal primarily with the basic handicrafts, for it is upon this groundwork that machine production is built. And in fact, all the machine can ever do is translate the essential hand operations into rotary movements of the cutting tool. In other words, even if you're going to use tools to make furniture, you still have to understand how you would have done it by hand. And therefore, you have to understand the medium. You have to understand wood. So this big book, which is 500 pages about how to make furniture, the first 100 pages don't mention furniture or tools at all. They tell you about wood. They tell you about the moisture content. They tell you about how much it shrinks. They tell you about which cuts are stronger. They give you these photographs of the different grains. The important thing here to understand is that this author says the important thing to know about making furniture is to understand the wood from which you're making it. Even if you're using machines, you still need to understand the wood. Even if when you get a job, even if you're using something like React or WordPress or Joomla or whatever to construct your HTML, if you don't know your HTML, you're not going to get good HTML out of the machine. Anyone who's only been shown how to force a piece of wood against a mechanized saw will have learned very little. But if he, because this is 1970, if he has had to saw that piece of wood by hand, he'll be more likely to know that much more about it. He will have greater respect for it and will understand in greater depth the problems that will have to be faced in its manipulation. Excuse me, I would have muted, but I don't know StreamYard, so I don't know how to mute. Here's another book about woodworking. This is by Mr. Toshio Odate. It's called Japanese Woodworking Tools. And he says, the Japanese word shokunin is defined by both Japanese and Japanese English dictionaries as craftsman or artisan, but such a literal description does not fully express the deeper meaning. Shokunin means not only having technical skill, but also implies an attitude and social consciousness, a social obligation to work his best for the general welfare of the people, an obligation both material and spiritual. So the first thing I want you to take away from this talk is that you need to be a shokunin of the web. You need to build it respecting the raw material, HTML, understanding it, knowing what's best to use for what, and you need to understand the social basis upon which the web is made. When Tim Berners-Lee made it, he didn't patent it. He gave it to the world. It's stewarded now deliberately to be for everybody, so everybody's included. Nobody gets locked out if they read Arabic, so right to left, or Hebrew. Nobody gets locked out if they use vertical text like some Chinese, Japanese, or Korean texts. Nobody should be locked out if they can't see very well, if they can't use a mouse, if they can't hear, if they can't move, if they have a slow network, if they have a $50 Android machine because that's all they can afford and they share it with the rest of their family. Everybody's to be included. That's the social construct upon which Tim deliberately based the web, which we who make web standards work towards, and which I want you to carry with you. Yes, you can run a business with it. Yes, it will propel your career and you will get work from it. But never forget that you got it because it was built with this social model in mind, and you have a moral obligation to pass that forward and keep everybody else included, just like you're being included now. So HTML1, it wasn't called HTML1, it was called HTML tags. And it was just a document that Tim wrote in 1991. There were 18 tags, and some of them were never used. Many of them you'll recognize. Title, A makes a link, P for a paragraph, H1 to H6, the address tag, a UL for an unordered list, the menu tag, which never really took off, but that was for site menus. DIR for direction, so that you could put text in right to left for Hebrew and Arabic. And this worked really well, but it was mostly scientists who were using the web. It was great because people with different kinds of computers, and there was no interoperability then, could all access documents and share them. And it was scientific documents. Nobody cared about how it looked. The great thing was that they could all read documents from other machines. 4 years later, HTML2 came across, and it added some tags. The image element is there. Image had been added later by Mark Andreessen of Netscape, and interestingly, it didn't have the alt attribute. So there was a gap of about 3 years when you could put an image on a page, but you couldn't put alternate text for people with disabilities. Already they were starting to add things to with a view to people designing pages. So you could say image, a line equals top, a line equals left, a line equals right. You could have the BR tag to have a break in a line to make addresses go on multiple lines. HTML2 added basic forms, and then it was added to with tables, client-side image maps, internationalization. HTML3 came about and never actually shipped. HTML3 was too much, and the browser vendor said, we cannot ship all the stuff that you're specifying. So they went back to the drawing board and they wrote something called HTML 3.2. What's interesting about this is it added widely deployed features such as tables, applets, text flow around images. These things have been added by Microsoft and Netscape, not in consultation with anybody. They just added them because they wanted to give developers and designers more control. What HTML 3.2 did was it looked at the things that Microsoft had made and Netscape had copied, or vice versa, and retrospectively standardized them. They were already in the browsers, but they just standardized them so that anybody else making a browser in the future, as Chrome did, as Firefox did, as Safari did, would understand what these tags are supposed to do. And interestingly, in HTML 3.2 in January 97, they added the style and the script tags, but they said these are placeholders for the introductions of style sheets and client-side scripts in future versions of HTML. The important thing to know here is that HTML 3.2 had full backwards compatibility with HTML2. So nothing was broken, nothing was made redundant or obsolete. And it also bagged up things that were already out there, but nobody had written them down. HTML4 took between 97 and 2000 to make. And again, it adopted many browser-specific elements, but at the same time, it sought to phase out Netscape's visual markup features by marking them as deprecated. Deprecated means they'll still show okay in browsers, but you as web authors shouldn't use them anymore because style sheets were going to take over. And then I'm afraid in the year 2000, with HTML 4.01 out of the door, the W3C went down to the park and drank too much vodka and passed out. And it stopped developing HTML. It was very interested in something called XHTML, which was which was HTML as if it was done properly. You can see that we've already had 9 years of Wild West of different people just excuse me, inventing tags, putting them in browsers, not consulting with anybody, which then had to be retrospectively standardized. Some tags closed, like, I don't know, title has a closing tag with /title. Other tags like break and image and input don't have closing tags. There was no real thought behind it. It was just a Wild West. And the W3 said, right, let's go and make HTML properly. Let's make sure that everything is well formed, everything has a closing tag. And the trouble is that this took ages and it was going to break backwards compatibility. Meanwhile, a lot of us in the web industry were very scared of things like Flash and something from Microsoft called Silverlight, which gave developers a lot more control for making things like applications, things that duplicated desktop application-like features, which the web just couldn't do. So Opera, where I worked, and Mozilla, some of us just got together informally and said, what about if we could extend HTML 4.0, forget about XML, forget about XHTML, extend it to bring in more functionality to compete with Flash and Silverlight, because Flash was owned by Adobe, Silverlight was owned by Microsoft. They were great technologies, but you don't want the web to be in the hands of any one particular business. We went to the W3C and said, let's do this. And they said, no, we're not interested. So we did it anyway in a group called the WhatWG, Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. And it was called Web Forms 1, then it was called Web Apps. And then finally, after a lot of toing and froing, in October 2014, HTML5 came out, and it was full of new tags. It standardized lots of things that were already in browsers, but nobody had ever written down, like embed or like XML HTTP request. It added lots of new things for web applications, like WebSockets, messaging, storage, and also a lot of stuff that people call HTML5 and not HTML5 at all, such as geolocation and WebGL for 3D graphics. But the important thing with this is that finally we had an open standard that Opera, Apple, Google, Mozilla, and Microsoft were all collaborating on, that was finally able to compete with Flash and Silverlight. And if you haven't heard of Silverlight now, if you don't know what Flash is, the reason you don't know what they are is that HTML5 worked. Now there is no version number. It's called HTML Living Standard. W3C wanted to publish a finished version of HTML5, while the WhatWG wanted to continue working on a living standard for HTML, continuously maintaining the specification rather than freezing it in a state with known problems and then adding new features as we needed to evolve the platform. So there is no version number for HTML now, and there never will be again. All there will be is a constantly evolving spec. If things are in the spec, but no browser ever implements, they will be dropped from the spec. If somebody has a good idea and everybody likes it, it gets added to the spec and iterated upon before it gets completely locked down. That can make it quite difficult for you to know what is actually usable and what is still in a state of flux. I urge you to look at the developer's version of the HTML5 spec. The link is on the bottom of this slide, and I'll give a PDF to Jess so you have the links in a clickable format. This is a specification, the full specification, but it takes out all the geeky stuff that's for browser engineers and just maintains stuff for people like you and for people like me who just want to look at the spec and go, okay, I can use that in all modern browsers. That's solid. That's usable now. Excuse me. So you might be looking at HTML and thinking it's a terrible mess. Yes, it is. You might be looking at HTML and thinking it's like a mad scientist's laboratory trying to stick together loads of different pieces and animate it. And yes, it is. You're right. The reason is it started off in a nuclear physics lab. Then it got popular, wildly popular. Microsoft and Netscape did their own thing. Google did their own thing. Everybody did their own thing. And we could never go back and take anything out because websites had been written and were using those tags. And you can't go and change them. You can't break old content. So yes, it's a terrible mess. Yes, it's weird. Yes, it's inconsistent. But that, perhaps paradoxically, that weirdness and that inconsistency is what gives it its strength. Websites made 30 years ago still work today. Websites made today with HTML will still work in 30 years' time, and in 60 years' time, and in 100 years' time. Because when Sir Uncle Timbo made HTML, there were certain design principles. They've been retrospectively written down in 2007, and these are them. When we're making HTML, we have to always think about compatibility. Is this compatible with existing content? So like we couldn't retrospectively decide that the image tag is going to have an opening IMG and a closing IMG, because browsers that supported that would stop showing existing content properly. And that existing content, now that everything's on the web, that would basically be like burning books in a museum. Do not reinvent the wheel. You know, if something exists and it does the job and people know how to use it, even if it's not the best way that you could think of now, don't reinvent it. It's there, it works. Why waste your time reinventing it? One of the HTML design principles is utility. Do we solve a real problem? A lot of people say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had an ISBN tag, for example, to mark up book numbers? Or wouldn't it be great if we had a football results tag? Well, would it? What actual real problem would that solve? I mean, in theory, we could have a tag for every single human on Earth. But the more tags we have, the more difficult it is for developers to decide which one to use. So we kind of work on an 80-20 rule whereby, 80% of problems get solved. It's not going to solve every edge case, but that's okay. We want to solve real problems, not philosophical problems. A thing called the priority of constituencies. If ever there's a conflict, you must consider users first, then developers, then browser vendors, then people who write specifications, and last, think about the elegance and the philosophical purity of the specification. So when the W3C were doing XHTML, they were making a nice, philosophically satisfying HTML done right specification. The problem was that was going to break existing websites for all users. So they got the priority of constituencies wrong. They were thinking about elegance of specification at the expense of users. We're doing it the other way around. The users come first. Users want to use websites. And if we break any existing websites, we're hurting the most important group. Everything has to be secure by design. The web has an excellent security model. If you don't download anything, the web is secure. You compare that with installing an app where the most trivial of apps will ask to share your contacts, sensitive data, financial info, etc. And the separation of concerns, we want to have content HTML. In your HTML, we want to have design, fonts, background colors, border styles in a separate language, CSS. Other design principles, interoperability, to make sure that a website can be operated on Safari on an iPhone, Microsoft Edge on your work computer, Firefox on your home computer, and Chrome on Android, is we have to define how things behave. So the specification is super big, and that's why I recommend that you look at the developer edition, because the vast majority of the spec is telling browser vendors the exact algorithmic steps to implement all of these APIs. The fact that there's exact algorithms means that it works the same across browsers, but none of us need to know that stuff. Avoid needless complexity. This is generally good advice for life. Handle errors. It's vital that if there's an error or a mistake in the HTML, that the browser knows how to deal with it. And the answer is never just stop. In the XML, in the XHTML world, if you got a single badly formed tag, if you were missing a single closing tag, the spec said, show nothing. Obviously, that's a really bad idea in the real world. Universal access is one of our HTML design principles. Whenever we're designing something new, we think about this. Is it media independent? That is, can I still use this thing regardless of the medium? So, okay. If you print out a web page, you can't click on the link. And that's not a reason not to have links, because links are the heart of the web. But what we can do is we can say, if this is being printed, don't underline the link in blue, but insert in brackets around it the destination of the link, so the person reading it can type it into a computer and go there. If you don't have a visual browser, okay, you can't use the JPEG that you're showing, but you can use the alternate text. We design everything so that it can be used independently of the kind of media. Supporting world languages. It's a worldwide web. Every language from left to right, right to left, vertical languages, Japanese with Ruby annotations need to be supported. And accessibility, making sure that everything can be used by people with disabilities. This guy, you met him before, Timbo, he said, this is for everyone when he opened the London 2012 Olympics. And it was the first website. This is the first ever website on modern Chrome. And it works. Just watch this. You can see that I can shrink my screen and it all reformats beautifully. It's perfectly responsive. I can hit the tab key and I can go through the links, and there's a circle to show me what I'm focused on now. Now, if I hit the space bar, it will go to that link. The web, by design, this is a 30-year-old site. The web, by design, is not only future compatible, this page still works in a modern browser, but it was responsive and accessibility out of the box by design. But we, as an industry, broke it. We broke it in many ways. For a time, people were sure that every monitor was going to be the same size. So we standardized on 800 by 600. And then mobile phones came and showed us that that was a really bad plan. We broke it as developers or designers by having light gray text on a white background, which is terrible for anybody like me who wears glasses. We broke it by insisting upon pixel perfect layouts. So designers couldn't allow browser differences in the layout. They had to basically chop up Photoshop comps. We broke it by publishing videos and not having captions, so that somebody on a loud bus or somebody in a quiet office who doesn't want to turn their speakers on, or somebody who can't hear has no idea what's in the video. We broke it by turning off keyboard accessibility. The irony of this is that So many developers, when in their text editors, their code editors, they don't use the mouse at all. They're using the keyboard for everything. And yet they turn off the ability for people to browse the web with just their keyboard. We broke it by turning off the ability to see what current link is focused, so that somebody like me, who prefers to use the keyboard to navigate, but nevertheless has eyes to use a monitor, I don't know on some sites what's actually focused. So I don't know if I hit enter, what's going to happen. A friend of mine called Billy Gregory said, when user experience doesn't consider all users, it should be known as some users experience, or sucks. So to really do the web properly, we need to understand the raw materials: JavaScript, HTML5 or HTML, and CSS, which was called CSS3, but like HTML, CSS is now a living standard. It doesn't have a version number. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are not enemies. In this picture, you'll see me in the middle. I invented the picture element in HTML. On the left is Brendan Ike, who invented JavaScript, and on the right is Howcome Wee and Lee, who invented CSS. And look, we're all very civilized, having a beer together and not fighting. Anybody who tells you that HTML and CSS are rubbish and JavaScript is the best, or JavaScript is rubbish and you should never use it, they're all talking nonsense. These three technologies work hand in hand to make the web. So I've seen a lot of articles like this, and I've taken the name of the author away because I don't want to pick on the author. This is something that I see a lot in our industry, and it's making our industry sick and ill. The article's talking about 10 things to learn for becoming a solid full stack JavaScript developer. Have a fundamental understanding of JavaScript. Well, yeah, if you're going to be a JavaScript developer, you should probably understand JavaScript. Okay. Know a front-end framework. Well, I would disagree that to be a proper JavaScript engineer, you need to know a front-end framework. I know plenty of excellent JavaScript engineers who know no frameworks at all because they understand JavaScript. Understand something called Bootstrap 4. I don't even know why this advice is here. And then, as a kind of a last but not least, understand HTML and CSS. And the author says, as for HTML, there's not much to learn right away, and you can kind of learn as you go. Know the difference between span and div. They'll save you a huge amount of headache when fiddling with your CSS code. And this is really bad. This dismissive attitude to HTML and CSS, two of the three pillars of the web, makes for a bad developer, and a bad developer makes a bad site. Understand the raw materials, understand the wood. HTML is declarative. I say button, type equals button, click me. And magically a button will appear in my browser. Yeah, it's going to look different in Safari than Firefox. It's going to look different on Linux and iOS and Windows. That's okay. I just declare a button exists and it magically happens. I don't have to draw it. I don't have to know what the system standard for drop shadows is. I don't have to know whether the cursor's hovering over it. It just does it. And this is a superpower. HTML is fault tolerant. Netscape invented the blink tag. Microsoft never implemented it. But crucially, if Microsoft's browser saw a blink tag, it would show the text, "Oh my God, you're having a seizure." It wouldn't blink because it didn't support blinking, but it still shows the content. And that is a superpower of HTML. If a browser sees a tag it doesn't understand, it still shows the content. So that means, for example, when in HTML5 we invented the video element, we built upon this. In a HTML5 browser, the video source equals video MP4. That will play. and the person won't see what's inside the tag, that paragraph and that link. But in Internet Explorer 6, which didn't support HTML5, the browser said, okay, I don't know what the video tag is, I'll ignore that, but I'll show the content. And the content is, I can't play it, download it here. The user would click on that link, download the MP4, and play it on their operating system's media player. So nobody gets a worse experience. People with a more modern, more capable browser get a better experience, but nobody's locked out. And that way, we can be backwards compatible. So in HTML3, which, as I told you, never actually got shipped, it did silly things like this. There was a fig element for a figure. Fig, SRD, equals Nicodemus.jpg. The problem with this is that any browser that didn't understand HTML3, and that was every browser because this was still in draft, none of them would show an image because it would say, I don't know what the fig element is, so I'll drop it and ignore it. I'll show the inside, the caption, the credit, but I won't show the image, which was daft. So HTML5 wanted to have a figure element. So we have a figure element, and inside that we have an image. So any browser that doesn't understand the figure element will still show the content, the image that's inside that. It will show the caption, and it will show the legend. It's backwards compatible. And paving a cowpath. When I invented the picture element in 2011, I looked at the video element and reused that syntax because developers already understood that. It was widely deployed. And so why reinvent something, or why make a new way of doing it when there's a way of doing something very similar that developers understand? So you've seen the first ever web page in a modern browser. This is the first ever browser, and it's my blog now, and it should still work. If I can set, yep, look. It's not the prettiest UI because this is from the early 90s, and it's gone to my site. Okay, there is no layout because this browser was written before CSS existed. It doesn't really know what to do with Unicode characters, but you can still access all the content. You can still tab through it. You can still hit enter and go to a link. You can still read the story I want you to know. So I've shown you that the first ever web page from 30 years ago works in a modern browser. I've shown you that my website made with jQuery and WordPress and all kinds of modern goodness, that still works on a browser from 30 years ago because I'm using HTML properly, and because the first web page made by Sir Uncle Timbo used HTML properly. HTML is interoperable. You've seen this in the design principles. Here I have misnested tags. I'm opening a B, I'm closing an I, and I'm closing the B before the I. In the old days, browsers didn't know what to do with this because HTML4 told browsers what to do with correctly formed HTML. And it said nothing about what to do with badly formed HTML. And obviously everybody listening to this talk has never ever made an error in their code in their life, and never will, because you're all geniuses. But there will always be somebody in your office who makes an error. And what HTML5 does is it has what is called an HTML5 parser. The parsing algorithm tells the browser exactly what to do with any possible permutation of incorrect markup. So if your HTML is badly nested like this, or you make a mistake, it might not produce the end result you want, but at least it will produce the same result you didn't want identically across browsers, which makes it a lot easier to debug. But also it means that a website that you can use on your desktop computer, you can use on your tablet, you can use on your mobile phone, even if it's Internet Explorer, iOS on your tablet, and Firefox on your phone. This is, I like to think of the HTML5 parser like this. It's a kind of ninja, incredibly powerful. Nobody ever sees it, and very few people even know it's there. Likewise, CSS is fault tolerant. If you don't know what CSS is, all you need to take home is the title. CSS is fault tolerance. Here I'm saying I've got a button. I want the font to be black and the background to be white. Good, easy to see contrast here. If you can do linear gradients, ignore my background white and put this attractive linear gradient. And if you can do this fancy new thing called Houdini Paint, don't worry, it's not even a thing yet, then ignore the background white and ignore the background linear gradient and instead do this fancy paint thing. So everybody gets something. People with a more capable, more modern browser might get a more interesting thing, but nobody's locked out. And that's the superpower of the web. JavaScript, on the other hand, is not declarative. It's imperative. You have to tell the browser exactly what you want done and how to do it, which is a lot harder. And it's a lot more brittle, because if JavaScript has an error, it'll either crash in a heap or do something absolutely appalling. Whereas HTML, every browser knows exactly what to do with any possible permutation of bad HTML. And HTML, if it doesn't know what a tag is, as you've seen, will still show the content, because the content is why your customers come to the site. So one of the principles that Sir Timbo was thinking of when he made the web was called the principle of least power. He said the choice of language is a common design choice. The low power end of the scale is simpler to design, implement, and use. But the high power end has all the attraction of being an open-ended hook into which anything can be placed, a door to uses bounded only by the imagination of the programmer. There's nothing wrong with JavaScript. JavaScript can do many things that HTML and CSS can't. But on the other hand, if you can do something in HTML and CSS, don't do it in JavaScript. Use the least powerful tool to accomplish the job. That's the principle of least power. So if you want something to change color when you hover over it with your cursor, use CSS, because that's less powerful than JavaScript. So it's less for you to get wrong and it's less to break for the user. Use the right tool for the right job. 13 million requests for JavaScript will time out every month, say BuzzFeed. Monitoring tells us 1% of requests for JavaScript on BuzzFeed time out. That's 13 million requests a month. That's you and me. That'll be me when I go down to London tomorrow afternoon. And if I'm looking at a website and I go through a tunnel, I won't get any JavaScript. Oh, the JavaScript won't work. It could be you getting on the tube. It could be you in rush hour traffic in Lagos or Lahore or Lima. It could be any of us. A friend of Jess's and a friend of mine called Stuart Langridge has this useful web page, and I made a video of it. Everybody has JavaScript, yeah? But actually, here's all the reasons why anybody might not have JavaScript right now. They might have JavaScript 5 minutes ago. They might have it in 5 minutes' time. But there's all these different reasons why JavaScript might not be working for them right now. And it's going to be more resilient for the situations when JavaScript isn't working. HTML gives you freebies. Great joke, write it down. You've all seen this. You've all seen a checkbox that says, check if you don't want not to opt out of cancelling us, stopping sending you spam forever. And I've marked up the two different demo versions of it in slightly different ways. The top one isn't good. When I start the video, if I click anywhere in that long label, nothing happens. I have to click exactly into that box. The second one, if I click anywhere in the long label, it fills in the box. This is great for somebody with Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis. It gives them a lot bigger target area to try and hit if they don't have great motor control. If you have great motor control, but you're on a bumpy car or a bumpy bus and you've got stubby little programmer's fingers trying to hit a small checkbox on a small screen, that can be a problem too. The top one, I see many places, but the bottom one's much better. And apart from a tiny bit of spacing to the right of the box, because I'm not using any CSS here, they do exactly the same thing. The top one, I've got an input type equals checkbox. Hooray for declarative HTML. I've just got a span with the label. The bottom one, I've got a label. I'm actually using the HTML label element because it's a label. And I'm associating it with that checkbox. I'm saying that the label is for thing. And I've given the input an ID of thing, so the two know that they're associated with each other. And that means just out of the box with no other coding for you to do at all, if you click anywhere inside the label text, it will fill in the checkbox or unfill the checkbox. And if a blind person with a screen reader is using the tab key, which only goes between links and input fields, if they tab into that input ID equals thing, their screen reader can find the label for thing and it will read it out to them so they know the context of the input box they've come to. This is just built in to HTML. You could do this with JavaScript, or you could just use it for free in HTML. And the obvious thing to do is to use it for free. The way that the web works is your website inside the browser makes an accessibility tree. And that maps to things it knows about in the underlying operating system. So all operating systems have checkboxes and radio buttons and input fields. So if you say in your HTML, input type equals checkbox, your browser tells your operating system, oh, it's a checkbox, you know what those are. And the checkbox and the operating system tells a screen reader, it's a checkbox because I know what they are. And then the screen reader tells the user, this is a checkbox. But if you just use a div or a span and some JavaScript, then the browser can't tell the accessibility tree, hey, this is a checkbox. So the accessibility tree can't tell the operating system, hey, this is a checkbox. So the operating system can't tell the screen reader, hey, this is a checkbox. And so the screen reader can't tell the user, hey, this is a checkbox. You can work around this with extra bolt-on stuff, but as you remember me saying at the beginning, built-in beats bolt-on bigly. So you have a button. You can either use a button element or you can have a div with a class equals button. And then you have to set an ARIA role in HTML or JavaScript. And you have to remember to manage focusability because divs are not focusable by the keyboard by default. And you have to listen for the correct key presses. You have to listen for a finger. You have to listen for a stylus. You have to listen for somebody hitting the space bar. You have to listen for somebody pressing the enter key. And if you don't know what ARIA or focusability are, it doesn't matter because you're hearing this mantra of built-in beats bolt-on bigly. You won't need to do this because you're just going to choose a button element and you're going to get the free behavior the browser just gives you from choosing the correct HTML element. So everybody's seen this, okay? This is every web page nearly. There's a header with your logo and a strap line, a div on the side, probably called nav, with links to other pages. You've got a main content area and some things inside that. It might be 3 different YouTube videos. It might be 3 different stories on a news site. It could be 3 different books on an Amazon site. And then at the bottom, you've got your footer with all your assorted other bump. Now in HTML4, we didn't have a way of saying to a browser, hey, this is a header, this is nav, this is the main bit, this is the footer. So we use div, but div has no special meaning at all. And in the spec, it says, authors are strongly encouraged to view the div element as an element of last resort for when no other element is available. Use of more appropriate elements instead of the div element leads to better accessibility for readers and easier maintainability for authors. Now, there's not an element for everything, and there should never be an element for everything. So sometimes you will use div, but when you can use a more appropriate element, use it. So HTML5 gives us header, it gives us nav, it gives us footer, it gives us main, it gives us article. And by the way, this isn't always a newspaper article. It could be an article of clothing, it could be an article of furniture. Each article could be a video or a book on Amazon or a news story. And the reason why these are good is that nobody gets hurt if you use header and nav instead of div. For users who don't use any kind of assistive technology, it won't look any different at all. You can style these with CSS just as you could a div of classic was nav. But for somebody who uses assistive technologies, this is a game changer. Screen reader users were asked, these are called landmarks or regions, nav, main, header, footer. How often do you navigate by landmarks or regions in your screen reader? All the time, 25%, often 18%, sometimes 28%. Only 28% of people said they seldom or never use them. So in other words, if you use nav, header, footer, main, you are giving extra help to 72% of people who need it at no cost to the people who don't need it. And let's show you that in action. This is a webinar I did a couple of years ago with an old friend of mine called Leonie Watson. And Leonie used to be a visual designer and she went blind in her 20s. And now she's a screen reader user. And so I asked her to show me how she surfs some websites. And because I didn't want to name and shame anybody else, I asked her to name and shame me. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this. This is Leonie navigating my website with a screen reader and explaining what's useful to her.
Lawson's personal site, Mozilla Firefox. Bruce Lawson's personal site. 27 regions, 21 headings, and 187 links. Bruce Lawson's personal site. Visited heading level 1 link. Bruce Lawson's.
So I'm going to stop that there. First thing you learn when you've got a screen reader is the key to stop it talking. There is only so much talking in your ear you can cope with during the course of the day. And in most screen readers, the control key is what will stop it talking. What you heard then was the screen reader do several things as the page loaded. It told me the title of the site, Bruce Lawson's personal site. That's the bit that's contained in the title element inside the header elements on the page. These days, I understand in the visual appearance of browsers, that's not a very visible piece of information. Back in the day when I last saw a browser, the title was very often displayed quite prominently at the top of the browser window. But for a screen reader user, it's still the first piece of information that you encounter on the page. And it's incredibly useful because it's often the first guarantee or first confirmation you've got that you've ended up on the page that you intended to reach. You might also have heard that the screen reader then just gave a quick summary of some of the key elements on the page. It told me there were some regions on the page and some headings. So already that's given me a bit of a clue as to how I can start exploring this page. One thing you can't do as a blind screen reader user is take in the page at a whole glance, and the footer and maybe the navigation off to one side and a content area somewhere. But of course, you can't do that sort of holistic assessment of the page as a screen reader user. What you can do, though, is use the regions of a page to explore the page in regional chunks like this.
Navigation region.
So it tells me there's a navigation region on the page, and if I hit that key again,
Search this site, clickable search region.
I've got a search region on the page.
Main region.
A main region, which tells me All things being equal, that's the main content area of the page.
Heading level 2 link reading list banner.
And then I come to a banner area, so something that's using the
Alert, Laura
element.
has left the meet.
And
Posted. Content information.
Some content information, so that's the footer there, and we can keep going through the page like this to find the different sort of chunks. HTML5 sectioning elements: header, footer, nav, main, or it could possibly be because Bruce is using the ARIA role equivalent. Role equals banner, role equals content info for footer, role equals main, role equals navigation.
It's
But
the
the
element.
upshot is the element, is it good?
Yeah.
So that's by far the best way to do it. So in that one shortcut, I can move the whole page, as in the key blocks that make it up.
Okay, so you can see that just by using the correct tags, you're giving somebody who needs a bit of extra help the extra help she needs to use your web page. And I'm very pleased that last year, when they did a survey of 1 million web pages, that footer, header, and nav appear in more than 50% of web pages out there on the web. I'm going to very briefly touch on structured data because this will help you impress your bosses. People like me have always been saying, if you use your markup properly and structure your data, you help search engines understand the different components. And a couple of years ago, Google finally actually gave us some numbers. So 100% increase in year-on-year growth from traffic in search by using structured data, 115% in organic traffic, 270% increase in new user registrations, 2.7 increase in traffic from search engines, 1.5 times increase in session duration. These are the kind of things that make your bosses or clients happy. And when they're happy, they either build a 40-meter high golden statue of you in the office car park, or they give you a pay rise. How do you do this? Well, this is what I do on my own website. Each blog post is an article, and I tell the search engines it's an article by saying the item type is a blog posting from schema.org. Schema.org has a schema, a vocabulary to describe almost everything you can think of, from medical equipment to recipes to football results. I'm telling the search engine that here's a headline. I'm telling it that this time element, in which I put the date time of when I published it, I said that's the date created. It's also the date that it was published. And I've put pub date in there because Apple want pub date instead of date published. And web development is really great fun because of weird things Apple like to do. So I've got this markup. And then in Safari Reader on an iWatch, it knows how to lay out something in an article element. If it sees something in an article tag, it knows how to lay it out. And it knows how to lay out things using those item props of author, pub date, etc. Now, I know that when you look at me, you're thinking, hey, Bruce, you're neither glamorous nor beautiful. How did you get on the early beta for an Apple Watch to check out this markup? And my answer will be, well, actually, I am glamorous and beautiful, okay? But I didn't need to get on the beta. In fact, I wrote that code 7 years before the Apple Watch existed. I never even thought there ever would be a watch on which I could read the web. But because I used the right elements, it wasn't div class equals article, it was an article tag. And because I used figure and fig caption rather than just a paragraph or a span, a future device I could never even dreamed of knows how to consume that content. So I future-proofed my website by using the correct HTML. Similarly, if you use input type equals tel, then the watch will show the right keyboard for typing in a telephone number. Input type equals date, and the watch will show this just out of the box. This is built-in behavior, and remember, built-in beats bolt-on bigly. before, I don't even know if any of you are still here, actually. Maybe I'm just talking to the wall, but in case one or two of you have fallen asleep, but this like leaks into your subconscious, accessibility for disabled people is part of usability. There's a study done at a university in Switzerland. High conformance with web accessibility guidelines provides benefit to users without disabilities. Basically, they had different websites. One was low accessibility, one was middle, one was high. And they tested them with people who did not have disabilities. So not the target audience for accessibility. A high level of web accessibility led to better performance, i.e. task completion time and task completion rate, than low or very low accessibility. Likewise, high web accessibility improved user ratings. That is perceived usability, aesthetics, workload, and trustworthiness compared to low or very low web accessibility. And that's from the University of Fribourg. There's a link. This is my friend Jamie Knight, who's an autistic web developer at the BBC. And he said something really profound that resonates with me. He said, "No one comes to our sites disabled. They come with impairments. We disable them." If you're using semantic HTML, using the right tag for the right job, if you're using the principle of least power, you're going a long way to doing it well, to enabling people instead of disabling them. If you take nothing else from this talk, built-in beats bolt-on bigly, and wherever the fluffy bunny of good HTML goes, the Tweety bird of accessibility rides along. And looking at those two, I can tell you they were absolutely delicious with a nice sauce. Sir Uncle Timbo said, "The web is for everyone, and collectively we hold the power to change it. It won't be easy, but if we dream a little and work a lot, we can get the web we want." In the words of the car parking machine outside the Chinese restaurant in the Birmingham Chinatown, change is possible. What you can do, you can learn the semantics of HTML. There are 120-ish elements. That's all. Just 120. To put that into context, most 2-year-olds can say about 100 words in their first language. By the time your toddler is 2.5, she'll probably know close to 300 words. There's 120 in HTML. Be better than this. And this, by the way, was delicious with a good sauce. You can run automated tests and go for low-hanging fruit. In a survey of the top 1 million homepages for accessibility, the most common failures were bad contrast, missing alternate text on images, empty links, missing form labels, and I've shown you why form labels are important, missing document language and empty buttons. These are trivial to test for and trivial to correct and make an enormous difference to your users just by using HTML correctly. If you want to check contrast, Ada Rose Cannon has a contrast checking widget that will analyze the page you're on and actually highlight where the contrast is bad. And you can use HTML and CSS wherever possible. You can make sites that work without JavaScript, then enhance with JavaScript. They might work weirdly, they might be clunky, they might be difficult to use without JavaScript, but they will still work, and that's what's important to your users. Choose your libraries carefully. You'll be told about dozens of libraries as you go through this course and as you read around and as you go into the workplace. 10 on UI is a great component library. Everything you can take, it's open source, and every one of them has been tested with people with a variety of disabilities. So that's Bruce approved. Big name libraries like React Bootstrap, they have a navigation component, but when you look under the hood of the HTML, they have div class equals nav. They should have nav class equals nav. NAV, DIV, they're both the same length. It's not harder to type in NAV than DIV, but they're not using the correct tag for the correct job. So what no nav? Bruce rejected. It's not just React stuff. This is Angular. They have a nav thing, but yeah, it's just a div, and div has no meaning. If it's a nav, mark it with a nav. Also, don't use JavaScript unnecessarily. The amount of JavaScript going over the wire is vast. My friend Alex Russell said, we need to confront the developer experience bait and switch. Tools that cost the poorest users to pay wealthy web developers a bunk. People will tell you, use React, you'll get the job done faster. But that makes your life easier at the expense of your users. Smartphones are everywhere, but most smartphones are not iOS or the top of the range Android phones. I looked at what was on sale in Cambodia last month on Alibaba, and the phones there, they're perfectly good devices, $18, $20, $16. This is what most of your customers are using. Data is expensive across the world. In the UK, I pay 0.016% of my monthly income on mobile data. In Indonesia, they'll pay 0.15%. In Rwanda, they'll pay 0.5%. But in Yemen, where I was born, that 1 gigabyte of data costs 16% of their monthly income. In Burundi, 9.4%. In Malawi, 13.2%. So the more bloated stuff you send, you're costing these people more money. Across the world, the highest average cost for 1 gigabyte of data is 30,000% more than the cheapest average price. And it's not just cost as well, it's data speed. Here in the UK, where I am, the median UK speed is 28 megabits a second. In the US, it's 55 megabits. In Hong Kong, it's 112 megabits. In Rwanda, it's 0.81 megabits. So the more information you're sending down, the more it costs your user in actual money, and the longer it takes them to download. So make your images smaller. There's a modern format called Avif. One website I built recently, I could reduce the total image size from 1.72 meg to 172 KB just by converting the images to Avif and using the picture element. Because yes, your big hero images are lovely, but in Nigeria, the data needed to watch just 2 minutes of online video a day can cost more than sending a child to school for a month. And yes, your auto-playing video is great, but it's not better than educating a child. Similarly, in India, your React application will never load faster than 1.1 second on an average phone in India, no matter how much you optimize it. Your Angular app will always take 2.7 seconds to boot up. There's 1.1 billion people in the world like me who have high-speed internet. 3.2 billion internet users in the world. 5.2 billion people have mobile phones, and 7 billion people in the world live at least within mobile phone coverage. By the end of this century, 50% of the world will live in these 10 countries. And we have to think about the people there now, their data plans, their network connectivity. Developing countries are home to 94% of the global offline population. The World Bank has said making the internet universally accessible and affordable should be a global priority. Because for many of you and for many people across the world, the internet and the web isn't just a mechanism for looking at funny pictures of cats. To somebody with a feature phone and an internet connection, but miles to walk to a doctor, where there is no doctor, a village healthcare handbook is available in 120 different local languages to help people get first-line medical care. Some places, for some people, school textbooks are incredibly expensive, but the cheapest Android device and an internet connection and worldreader.org you have tens of thousands of school textbooks available for free. And there are people around the world in terrible regimes, and some of them have the wrong religion or the wrong political opinions, or they happen to love the wrong gender of person, for whom connection to the outside world is a lifeline. And the internet brings that for them. As Mr. Ghonim said in the Arab Spring, if you want to liberate a country, give them the internet. And if my hippie bullshit has bored you, look at some numbers. McKinsey, who's a big consultancy to governments and big businesses, they said an increase in internet maturity similar to the one experienced in mature countries over the past 5 years creates an increase in real GDP per capita of $500 on average during this period. 5 years, $500. It took the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century 50 years to produce the same result. Because, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, the internet is fundamentally and by design constructed to be a social thing. So Tim gave it to the world. It's not actually about computers, and it's not actually clouds, and it's not a series of tubes. It's these ladies in Africa. It's this blind gentleman in Toronto. It's these ladies that I photographed on a bus in Bangladesh. It's this elderly lady in a wheelchair in Taipei, Taiwan. It's this farmer and his granddaughter that I met in Cambodia. It is this young man on the subway in New York. And as Sir Tim said, this is for everyone. Thank you. You can ask me some questions, or you can go to the toilet or go to sleep.
Bruce, thank you so much. So you can find Bruce at
You're welcome.
brucelawson.co.uk.
Everybody still there?
Yeah. Folks, you're still here. Can you hear me okay?
Oh my word. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Oh gosh, y'all, everybody's just praising you. Don't praise him. Oh gosh, he's gonna make him
It's the shirts. It's the shirts they like.
So what I'd be really thank you so much. It was a fantastic talk. So this praise is well warranted. What kinds of questions can we get from I was gonna say the class. That's very formal. All of our beautiful people out there in internet land, are there any questions that Bruce can answer for you? I could sort of dig back in and see, oh, you know what? Look, I'm going to put these up on the screen just so you can see exactly how big-headed you should be getting. Oh, thank you, Jess and Bruce. Ha, ha, ha.
Thank you, Anke. Thank you, Hola Soy Milk. Thank you, Remco.
Oh, this is going to be we've got an actual question. And I'll go ahead and read it just for folks who might not be able to see it. We'll get t-shirts.
$10 Udaipur, a market in Udaipur in Rajasthan. $5 for the material, $5 for the tailoring. You pay my airfare, I'll go and buy you one.
So Jeremy is asking, hey, as someone who's been in the industry for a while, which is a very polite way to call you old, I really like that. What do you think of web builders like Wix or Squarespace? How are they going to affect the future of web development jobs?
I used to consult for Wix. I'm very fond of them. They have really upped their game in the accessibility and search engine findability of the code they produce. Maybe Squarespace have now. It's just I don't know, because I used to work with Wix, so I followed them more closely. I firmly believe that not only should everybody have access to the web, but to read the web, but everybody should have access to making websites on the web. And, I look at things like Wix and Squarespace. It doesn't cost a great deal more to host on them than it does for me to host my WordPress blog, which I have to make myself, and I have the skills. The difference is there will always be a need for web developers. like when WordPress came out and a lot of web developers said, oh no, people will start making their own websites and web developers won't have work anymore. What actually happened is the good web developers still were employed, and terrible web developers dropped out of the industry because they were terrible web developers, and a whole new cottage industry of people who make WordPress sites started up. And it's exactly the same with Wix and Squarespace. Bring it on. Anything that makes
And
the web
yeah,
easier is good for me.
as somebody who is a terrible web developer, some might have just decided to teach.
I know what you're saying.
We've got someone else asking, thanks, Bruce, great presentation, because who doesn't like to wrap this in a bit of praise? And they're wondering, hey, you know what? Dark mode seems increasingly popular right now as a website default. Well, what do we think about that? What do we think about dark mode as a website default?
As a default, I don't have an opinion. I do have an opinion about dark mode, and you now in CSS we have the ability to say, has the user said they want dark mode? And it might not just be because it's nighttime. It might be because they have a migraine or something like that. And respecting your user's wishes is obviously the polite thing to do. Whether it's default, I don't much care. What I care about is that my wishes be respected.
And this is me adding on to this. Has anyone ever seen the website Dev2? They've got a pink mode where I could come up with some very, very contrived, like, oh, I think it's good for access. No, but it's just very pink. If you want the full Hello Kitty strawberry bubbles immersive experience, like, I quite like it.
I like a strawberry bubbles experience because that's the kind of bubble bath that I intend to use later on this afternoon. And I'm a big Hello Kitty fan.
Obviously, you're wearing the Hello Kitty trousers under the desk, but haven't shown us yet. Catherine's got a really good question about, oh heck, where's this going? I use a lot of divs for CSS styling. So wrapping declarative HTML tags in divs with classes, is this good practice, or is this going to be disruptive to assistive technologies?
Nothing wrong with it, Catherine. There's nothing wrong with a div. The bad thing is if you're using the div instead of a semantic tag. If you use, for example, a nav tag, if it's around your nav, it doesn't matter in the slightest if you're nesting 460 divs within that to apply some styling on. It doesn't matter. It's actually the ratio of divs to more semantic tags that's important. Nothing wrong with a div, but don't use it instead of a nav or a header or an article or a footer. Is that
something
clear?
This is something Catherine would never do. So you're mostly just telling me, Jess, don't do it.
Catherine is obviously a highly intelligent and great developer. Somebody hire her or him.
So Steve is asking, speaking of jobs, and say, hey, you mentioned an accessibility checking job. Where, how do I? Yeah.
Bruce L on Twitter, just send me a tweet, and I will introduce you to Lily, who is our charming and marvelous delivery manager, who's actually dealing with the hiring.
And what company was that over at again? I remember, just in case they don't.
That's a Babylon Health who employ me, but I'm here speaking by myself, and this is nothing to do with my employers, etc., etc. But I like I like working with nice people, and if I can't find one, I might have to work with you, Jess.
Oh, what's that? We've got a connection problem, I think. Adrian's saying, hey, you know what? And I'm just assuming that Adrian's like, wow, semantic HTML. But like, hey, what other resources might you recommend that learners can use to become better at using semantic HTML tags?
Read the spec. That developer edition of the spec without all the stuff that's only of interest to browser vendors It's really good. It's really easy to understand. It gives you lots of examples of when to use it and also when not to use it.
So we've got a really good question. We want your help getting in an argument. So Crispina's saying like, "Hey, I'm not a developer or designer." Well, I mean, if you're doing this boot camp, you're a web developer because you've written some HTML. But that's me being mean. Well, I'm not a developer or designer. Citation needed. How can I convince my managers that the design they paid for isn't great? The design they paid for is light gray text on a white background.
I would say tell them I said it's not great, but then you can see my shirt, so I'm not going to hold any status as a designer. What you should do, excuse me, if it's a real web page, you can Google. Other search engines are available. You can Yandex and Bing as well for color contrast checker. And if it's a page that's actually on the web, you could probably give it the URL. If it's not on the web, but if it's just a mock-up, but you have access to the color codes of that particular shade of white and gray, there will be color contrast checkers that you can input that into. And basically, if it doesn't meet the adequate contrast, which is 4.5 to 1 for small text and 3 to 1 for large text, it is not accessible. And depending on the sensibilities of your management and where the legislation where you work is quite possibly illegal. So that's what I would do.
Yeah. So I've gone ahead and I've dropped that into the chat. So give them that. If that's not going to convince them, either Bruce or I will fight your manager, hopefully via the internet, but we're not above a fist fight.
I am halfway to a black belt. I'm halfway to a black belt in kickboxing. So
Bruce will do it.
And I haven't had a fight for a long time, so it's time for another one.
So we were actually learning about this in yesterday's stream. So when you're doing input tags, and you should always have labels for accessibility, we learned that there's the option to either do your input element and then your label afterwards, or to nest your input element within your label tags. We learned that you can do them either way. Is there a preference? Is there a best practice? Do you have a take?
My preference is the nesting one, because then you don't have to have an ID. But unfortunately, a man who's cleverer than me, whose name is Adrian Rosselli, he pointed out there's an assistive technology called Dragon, naturally speaking. A colleague of mine who had cerebral palsy used to use it, and she can talk to her computer and say things like, press the not the submit button, choose the extra large checkbox. And there's a bug in Dragon whereby if the input and the label are nested, Dragon can't see it.
Oh.
Ordinarily, I am quite hardcore and I say, well, if it's a bug in software and I'm using the stuff correctly and according to spec, that's not my problem. But I can't, in all conscience, say that, because I know that I'll be locking people out. So now I've switched to using the input, the label for equals, and not nesting them until such time as Dragon get their act together. And I think they've just been bought out by Microsoft. So if anybody knows anybody from Microsoft, tell them to sort it out and we can use the nested pattern again.
We may well have a guest coming with us who may well be there. And we can go ahead and just bring that into, but like, hey, when are you going to fix this piece of software you have nothing to do with?
Yeah, they bought it, they own it. So
yeah. If we hassle you about HTML stuff, we can hassle them about new software. We've got such a good question from Joy. Do you know what? Every time I've seen Joy in the chat there, I was going to say just a joy, and I'm sure you hear that a lot. What are the best tools you'd recommend for beginners in web development? I guess this is either on the learning side or like, hey, what kind of tooling might you start a beginner with? Right?
It's just quite a difficult one, Joy, because now that I'm slightly over 30, it's been a long time since I was a beginner, and the tools have changed enormously. I would say probably the spec and the validator, which is validator.w3.org. You can either copy and paste your HTML in there, or you can upload from a local file, or you can point it at a URL and it will tell you if your HTML is correct. And it's unforgiving and grumpy, much like me.
I was gonna say it's like always getting to have a piece of Bruce with you on your desktop.
But I'll tell you
Or
what,
phone.
Joy. I'll tell you what, Joy. I was doing some live coding on stage, and my HTML wasn't going well, so I ran it through the validator, and it told me where the problem was, and the audience laughed and went, "So you make mistakes too?" And it's like, yeah, I especially do when I'm in front of 300 people. But nevertheless, you learn from your mistakes. Everybody does, and it's a great way of having your mistakes pointed out to you by somebody grumpy, the validator, but who never gets tired and never says no and never goes, "You've done that 28 times this week already, you fool," which is nice.
We've got an incredibly specific question here. Remco saying like, "Hey Bruce, hey Remco, do you have any experience with Joomla frameworks and accessibility?"
Until recently, I was on the Open Source Matters board of the Joomla Foundation, advising them on accessibility. So yes.
Remco, have you got a follow-up question? So yes is the short answer.
Marco Dings and Brian Tiemann. Brian Tiemann is the guy who invented Joomla, and he's super hot and interested and knowledgeable about accessibility. Tiemann, Teeeman, and he's a lovely, helpful chap on Twitter.
How do you no, I don't want to know how you describe me when I'm not around. Nope.
I say on Twitter.
So it looks like we've gotten through most of the questions. Bruce, thank you. I've just clocked that you've given yourself the title The Magnificent.
It wasn't me. It's AI.
Is it?
My magnificence.
Bruce, thank you so much for joining us.
Really
for those of you who aren't, I was going to say for those of you who weren't able to join this live, we'll go ahead and we'll make this video available. If you've only caught part of this, or if you want to review any of this. Next week, we're going to have another speaker, and we're going to have a guest speaker who's going to be talking to us about dev tools. So what are the tools that come bundled with your browser that can make it easier to do your job?
Oh, yeah, Joy, the dev tools, particularly the Firefox dev tools, of course. There's a really good video and an article by a Malaysian lady called Chen Hui Jing.
Who's just fantastic.
And she talks a lot about using dev tools, not just for debugging, but as a learning aid. I'm sure Jess can find the link and stick it in so everybody here can access. And Jessica, I will, when I can be bothered, because I'm hungry for my tea, I will send a PDF of the slide so that it's full of actually clickable links. If you could,
see, look at that. I give everybody homework, not just the learners. I'm going to go ahead and let you go to have dinner and hopefully have a really lovely evening. Thank you so much, Bruce. And thank you all so much for joining me. We're going to be back every single Wednesday with more guests. Next Wednesday, we're going to go ahead and be a little bit more fair to folks in different time zones. So we're going to go ahead and bring this out at a time zone that matches the schedule of our guests. So go ahead, and if you haven't enrolled in the boot camp, you're so welcome to. Oh, gosh. You can do that by heading over to classcentral.com. And if you head into the Bootcamp portal, you'll see all of the events and the schedule, and you're going to be able to add those to your calendar. It's right there on the events page of the portal. All of this is completely free. No one at any point will ask you for any money, and everything's okay. Fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and let all of you get to dinner or lunch or breakfast or having a nap. I really appreciate all of you making time to learn with us today, and I can't wait to see you again next week. Bye, everybody.